Hello to you and welcome. My name's Will, and today the topic is Brazil, the biggest country in South America, that really interesting, awesome, fascinating country. And today I'm going to tell you about 8 interesting points related to Brazil. So the first point is the language. So the official language in Brazil is Portuguese, and in the Lusophone world, or the Portuguese-speaking world, 81% of Portuguese speakers live in Brazil. So it is by far the most widely spoken variety of the Portuguese language. So they do speak Portuguese in other countries in the world like Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, and obviously Portugal. But I think if you're going to learn Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese is probably the best one to learn because they understand it throughout the Lusophone area. And it's also a lot softer and more melodic than European Portuguese. And this is because of the immigration that went to Brazil over the centuries. So for many years there were slaves from Africa that went to Brazil, but also migration came from countries like Korea, Japan, Italy, Spain, and even Germany. So therefore the language has become more sort of melodic and soft. If you have one phrase to learn in Brazilian Portuguese, it's this: Bom dia, tudo bem com você? So this means hello or good morning, how are you? Okay, so this is a really useful phrase, and if you go to Brazil and you make an effort to speak Portuguese, the Brazilians will be very receptive and very impressed that you can speak their language, and it will facilitate your whole trip to Brazil. There are other languages that are spoken in Brazil by the native South American population, and these languages are related to the Tupi-Guarani family. So these languages aren't actually that widely spoken in Brazil, but they are taught at the universities in some cities. But by far the main language is Portuguese, and it is worth learning some basic phrases if you go to Brazil to make your trip more interesting and more diverse. So the second point I want to tell you about Brazil is that the biggest city in the country, Sao Paulo, is actually the biggest city in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere. So Brazil, like many countries, has become very urbanized in terms of its population locations. And Sao Paulo is an absolutely enormous city. It's a huge metropolis. And the population of it in total of the greater metropolitan area is about 24 million people. So it's absolutely huge. And culturally, Sao Paulo is a very important city because it has all of the best museums and restaurants, bars, art galleries, and concert venues. And it also has the best university in the whole of Brazil, which is the Universidade de Sao Paulo, or Sao Paulo University. So it acts like a kind of magnet city, drawing people in from all over South America and all over the country. And it really is an incredible place with loads going on. It is also the business center for Brazil. So it has the Bovespa, which is the Brazilian stock exchange, and most of the international companies that come to work in Brazil have their headquarters in Sao Paulo. So it's very dynamic, it's a very important place financially. And also importantly, it has the busiest airport in the whole of South America, and this is Guarulhos International Airport. So this acts as a hub for connecting flights for the region. So if you're traveling to anywhere in South America, you would probably get a change in Guarulhos Airport. So it's an unbelievable city. It's very dynamic, got loads of energy, loads of life, loads of spirit. It's a great place. It's not a really beautiful place like Paris or Rome or Madrid or something like that. But it does have other advantages, like the amount of options there are for nightlife and cinemas, theatres, bars and things like that. Pretty much anything you're looking for you can find in Sao Paulo. It caters for all tastes. So the third point I want to mention about Brazil is coffee. So Brazil is the largest grower and producer of coffee in the world, and it produces over a third of the world's coffee supply. It grows beans such as Arabica and Robusta, and the state that produces most coffee in Brazil is called Minas Gerais, in the center of the country. They contribute to a lot of the blends in the world. So chances are if you go to Starbucks or Cafe Nero or something like that and you drink a blended coffee, it will probably contain some Brazilian beans. But they do also have special fazenda or special plantations where they grow single origin coffee as well. If you go to Brazil, everybody's mad about coffee. So they drink it all day and they drink it in these tiny cups. And normally they drink it black with a lot of sugar. So you have to be a bit careful. So for example, sometimes they actually make a huge vat of it and they add sugar when they're making it. So if you don't drink sugar in your coffee, you might be surprised to find that the coffee in Brazil is very sweet, because sugar is also a natural resource that grows in the country. And normally when Brazilians talk about coffee, they're talking about café coado, which is filter coffee. So they do have espressos and lattes and all the Italian styles, but normally it's black coffee that they drink. And it's a very sociable drink in Brazil as well. So if you go to someone's house, normally they'll offer you a cup of coffee, or even at work, it's quite common to have coffee with meetings or with colleagues. So if you're interested in coffee and the history of coffee, then there are museums in the cities of Santos and Campinas in the state of Sao Paulo, and you can find out all about the history of coffee and how it's produced in Brazil. So the fourth point I want to tell you about is the currency in Brazil, and this is called the real. The plural of this is reais. And this has been the currency since 1994, when they created the real plan. And the symbol for the real is this RS, and at the moment the real is worth about 15p, and £1 is worth about 6.7 reais. But obviously this does change and does fluctuate. The interesting thing is that Brazil's actually had over 10 different currencies throughout its history. So in the past it's had currencies like the Cruzeiro and the Cruzado and the Cruzeiro Novo, and due to problems with inflation and instability with the economy, they've had to scrap various currencies and bring in new ones to try and redress the problems. But it's a funny nation for anyone in the UK, because we've had the pound for such a long time. We've had it for as long as anybody can remember. So the idea of changing your currency is kind of unusual or kind of different to us, but the Brazilians have had this a lot. So when you talk to Brazilians in the past about what currency they had, a lot of the time they can't actually remember what the currency was at the time because it changed so frequently. So the real is a very established currency and is recognized throughout the world and is here to stay. But it's interesting to note that Brazil has passed through many different currencies in its time. So the fifth point I want to tell you about is the capital of Brazil. Brasilia is actually the third capital of Brazil. So Brasilia was built from scratch starting in 1956, and it was built by the president of the time, who was called Juscelino Kubitschek. And this was an extremely ambitious project, and the idea of it was to move the power base of Brazil away from the southeast of the country, from cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, to a more central location. And it took about 3 years to build the city, and it was a hugely expensive and ambitious project, and it was actually inaugurated in 1960. So the first capital of Brazil was Salvador de Bahia, and then it was Rio de Janeiro, and from 1960 it's been Brasília. So Brasília is a really interesting city, mainly because it is a very young city. It's very dynamic and very energetic, and is actually designed in the shape of an aeroplane, or at least the central part of the city is. And The architect who designed it, or the buildings, was called Oscar Niemeyer, and he's probably the most famous Brazilian architect of all time. And the town planner was someone called Lucio Costa. So if you go to Brasília, you'll see what I mean. It's a very interesting place, and the youthfulness of the city is probably the most interesting thing about it. But just because it's a young city doesn't mean that it doesn't have interesting culture. It has very interesting architecture and fantastic art galleries and museums. So it is a really interesting place to visit. And of course it's got all the things that you would normally find in a capital city, like the parliament for the country, the embassies for international countries, and the legal courts of justice. So it has all the infrastructure of a capital city, but it's just in a relatively young place. So the sixth fascinating point about Brazil is slavery. So Brazil actually received over 5 million slaves from Africa, and it is the country that by far received the most amount of slaves in the whole of the Americas and the Caribbean. In the past, it had been established that there were approximately 4 million slaves from Africa, but that has actually been revised recently by more research, and it is more closer to the 5 million mark. So it's an absolutely enormous number of slaves. And what's even more horrifying is that over 600,000 slaves actually died on the crossing between Africa and Brazil. So they actually died on the ships before reaching their destination. So this was an absolutely terrible sort of genocidal level of death, and it was a really horrific thing. This was because Portugal at the time had many colonies in West Africa, and therefore they could have a very strategic route that went between Africa and Brazil, and they could travel across the South Atlantic Ocean. And today in Brazil you can see a really strong influence from this African culture that was brought over by the slaves. And this is represented in things like the music, samba. This has a big bass and drum rhythm from African style musics. In religion, like candomblé, which is an African style religion. And also in capoeira, which is a dancing style that was created by slaves who were working in plantations and fields in Brazil. So there is a really strong influence from African culture in Brazilian culture today, and this is because of the slaves that came over. And now slavery is being discussed and debated in a very much more open way than it was in the past because of movements like Black Lives Matter, and this is called As Vidas Negras Importam in Brazilian Portuguese, and it's being talked about in the media, in universities, in newspapers and magazines, and there's a much more honest and open debate about the horrors of slavery and how terrible it was and how many people actually died. So Brazil now recognizes the impact that slavery had on the country, but also the impact that it had on its culture as a modern country today. So the seventh interesting point about Brazil is that it used to have a monarchy. So today Brazil is a republic, but until 1889, when there was a Republican coup d'etat, it had a monarchy. So this is one of the more interesting episodes in the history of the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1807, the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal was invaded by Napoleonic troops. And because this happened, the Portuguese royal family, known as the House of Bragança, decided to move their court to Rio de Janeiro from Lisbon and set up court there. So when Brazil became independent from Portugal in 1822, it was a descendant from this House of Bragança, or the Portuguese royal family, that became the emperor. And initially this was Dom Pedro I, or Peter I, and later in 1831 he actually abdicated and went back to Portugal in favour of his son Dom Pedro II, or Peter II. and he was the emperor until this Republican revolution that happened in 1889, and therefore there was this period in the 19th century where Brazil stood alone in having a monarchy in South America when all of its neighbours were Spanish-speaking republics. So it's a very interesting episode in history. And also, interestingly enough, in 1993 there was actually a referendum on this subject as to whether they should actually reinstate the monarchy in Brazil or to, bring it back. So it actually didn't win. It only got 13% of the vote, and they voted to keep the republic. So there is some support for the monarchy in Brazil, but in very small pockets, and it's a relatively marginal conversation now. But it does show that the monarchy does still exist in the mentality and the memory of Brazilians. So last but not least, the final point that I want to talk about is football in Brazil. So football is a veritable religion in the country. It's absolutely massive and everybody plays it. Doesn't matter what your background, age, race or gender is. It's by far the most popular sport. And interestingly enough, the Brazilian football team has won the World Cup a record number of times, 5 times, and it's the only team to have competed in all of the World Cup editions. So they won the World Cup in 1958, 1962, 1970, 1994 and 2002. So they've produced some of the best players of all time to play football, players like Garrincha, Pelé, Romario, Ronaldo, the Brazilian one, and more recently Neymar. And in the women's game, Marta is widely recognised to be the best player of all time. And the clubs have a big impact in the country. So the clubs are really important, and they also are very important sort of economically for the areas. So they create a lot of jobs, a lot of work, and they're really vital parts of the community in Brazil. And every town that you go to will have a football pitch and a football stadium for the local team to gather around and to create the feel of a community. Some of the major teams in Brazil come from Sao Paulo. So the Sao Paulo clubs are Palmeiras, Corinthians, Sao Paulo and Santos. And in Rio de Janeiro they have Flamengo, Fluminense, Vasco, Gigama and Botafogo. And in the south of the country, in Porto Alegre, they have Grêmio and Internacional. So these are some of the top clubs in the whole of Brazil. And it's a dream for a lot of Brazilian people to become professional football stars. So it's the absolute #1 goal for most of the young people in Brazil. And now it's actually become a really important topic that people talk about in the media. And there are lots of books about football in Brazil, and it's talked about at universities and pretty much at every level. So it's now recognised as a really important part of the culture of Brazil as well. So that was 8 interesting points about Brazil, that huge interesting country in South America, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to watch more videos on this topic, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might find it interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Ciao.